It was early spring of 1971 when I took the narrow road that ran along the Cornish cliffs, a road I'd never seen before, even after years of traveling that coast. The sea was rough that morning, throwing salt against the windshield like handfuls of sand. My camera gear rattled in the back seat. I wasn't looking for anything unusual, just the quiet of small harbors and shuttered pubs where the wind did most of the talking. But then the road curved, and through the fog, I saw roofs where there should have been only sea. It wasn't marked on any of my maps. The sign at the turn was half swallowed by moss, the letters just barely readable. Penhallow Cove. The name stirred something in me, as if I'd heard it long ago. The place looked untouched by the decade. Fishing boats painted in colors that had gone out of fashion. Cottages with slate roofs gleaming under a pale drizzle. It didn't feel abandoned, yet there was no movement. Just laundry frozen mid-sway on a line, and smoke curling from chimneys that gave off no heat. I parked near the harbor wall, camera in hand. Every photograph I took felt heavier than the last, like the air itself resisted being captured. Even the gulls circled slower than they should, their cries drawn out as though the sound had distance to cross. The tide didn't move, not forward, not back. It just waited. There was a clock above the post office door, its hands stuck at 3:47. A man inside was reading a newspaper dated 20 years earlier. He looked up as I entered, but didn't seem surprised to see me, only confused, like someone waking from a dream they thought they were still in. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, not unkindly. "Not today." When I turned back toward the harbor, the fog had thickened. The street I'd come down was gone, replaced by the edge of the sea, waves brushing against cobblestones that hadn't been wet before. Somewhere beyond the mist, I heard the faint toll of a bell, distant and wrong, ringing for a village that might no longer belong to this time, or to mine. I've tried over the years to convince myself that what I saw in Cornwall had an ordinary explanation. Fog can play tricks on the eyes, they say. Old coastlines shift. Entire settlements are swallowed by erosion or memory. I told myself that must have been the case, that Penhallow Cove was just a mirage of light, an illusion formed by sea mist and exhaustion. But illusions don't leave salt on your coat or sand in your shoes. They don't burn themselves into photographs that later come back blank. I was 29 at the time, working as a freelance photographer for a travel column that paid just enough to keep me wandering. Most of my assignments were forgettable, quaint fishing towns, postcards of ordinary lives. But that week, I'd been drawn to Cornwall without really knowing why. I told my editor it was for the landscape. In truth, it was something quieter, a pull, like a song I couldn't quite hear, humming beneath the surface of the waves. For years I kept the negatives from that trip sealed in a drawer. Every time I tried to look at them again, something in me hesitated. I couldn't decide whether I was afraid they'd show nothing at all, or afraid they'd show too much. When I finally did, decades later, the images had faded into a pale gray fog, every frame the same, the outline of a harbor that shouldn't exist. I've since returned to that coast many times. The maps haven't changed. The cliffs are still there. But the road I took that morning in 1971, the one that led to Penhallow Cove, it's gone. Before we go any further, if these kinds of stories speak to you, the quiet, unexplainable ones that linger long after they end, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. It helps me keep sharing these moments with you. Now, back to the story. The turning wasn't a proper junction so much as a hesitation in the hedgerow, an opening where the gorse thinned and a single strip of tarmac slipped toward the sea. I almost missed it. The main road carried on with the usual confidence of maps. This lane did not. It felt borrowed, like a path the land tolerated but hadn't agreed to keep. I slowed, indicator ticking in the empty morning, and let the car nose into the fog. Cornwall's cliffs rose and fell to either side, their faces veined with damp and salt. The smell came first. Kelp, cold iron, wet stone. The lane narrowed until the mirrors worried the brambles. My ordnance survey map lay on the passenger seat, creased to the familiar sheet number. I knew where every cove should have been. This, whatever it was, wasn't on it. Fog pressed against the windscreen in soft sheets, the wipers sweeping a gray that returned as soon as it left. The engine settled into a steady hum, a metronome for a world that had gone quiet. No bird song, no distant tractor. Even the sea, so close I could taste it, held its breath. A bend, another, then a straight that felt longer than it looked, and rooftops gathered out of the weather like a memory deciding to surface. Slate first, then chimney pots, then a scatter of cottages shouldering one another down toward a harbor cut into the rock. A painted sign leaned at a troublesome angle, moss swallowing half the letters, Penhallow Cove. The name moved through me with the strange ache of recognition. I couldn't have said from where. I parked by a stack of pots bleached to the color of old bone. The engine clicked as it cooled. Close to the water, a rowboat turned lazily on its rope without disturbing the surface, as if the sea's skin had thickened. Nets hung from pegs, stiff as if recently frozen, and a line of shirts drifted half an inch from stillness, caught between gusts that never arrived. I listened for the small proofs of life, a door latch, a dog, a radio behind glass. Nothing. Only the steady thud of my own pulse, and underneath it, a slower beat I couldn't place, like a distant bell remembering how to ring. I told myself I'd take a few photographs and carry on. Then I stepped out, and the air felt colder than the season allowed, as if the place had been waiting at that temperature for me to arrive. For several minutes I heard nothing but the faint creak of timber, masts shifting somewhere beyond sight. It took me a moment to realize there shouldn't have been any. The harbor looked empty, yet the sound came again, low and steady, as though the sea remembered something it refused to forget. I followed the noise along a narrow lane that smelled of brine and damp rope. The cottages were close together, walls brushed with salt, paint peeling in long vertical lines. Curtains hung but didn't move, even when the wind shifted. Each window felt like an eye that had forgotten how to blink. That was when I saw her. She stood at the far end of the quay beside a wooden stall, arranging fish on trays lined with cracked ice. Her coat was buttoned high to the neck, a scarf wrapped twice around her throat. The colors of both had bled to a kind of uniform gray, as though the fog had been feeding on them for years. "Morning," I said, and my voice startled me. It sounded too loud in the hush. She looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Morning," she answered. Her accent had that Cornish curl, soft, old-fashioned. I asked if this was Penhallow Cove. She hesitated before replying. It was, last I knew. The phrasing caught me off guard. "Last you knew?" Her eyes shifted toward the sea, where the fog trembled like breath on glass. "Tide comes in strange here," she said quietly. "You'll want to leave before it does." I tried to smile, but it felt misplaced. "I came by the upper road. I can be back before dark." "The upper road?" She frowned, shaking her head. "That road fell in years ago." I opened my mouth to answer, to insist she was mistaken, but the air around us changed. The gulls stopped crying mid-call. The harbor's soft percussion halted, and even the faint hum in my ears from the long drive seemed to vanish. For a second, I thought I'd gone deaf. When sound returned, it came wrong. Stretched, slowed, as though the entire village had missed a beat. The woman glanced at me again, her face unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured. "Not on a day like this." A gust of fog swept in between us, thick as smoke. I stepped back, shielding my eyes, and when I lowered my arm, she was gone. The stall remained, fish neatly arranged, frost still clinging to their scales. I turned in slow disbelief, scanning the street. Doors that had been closed now stood ajar, revealing narrow halls, lit by faint orange lamplight. In one window, I thought I saw someone standing behind lace curtains, watching. But when I blinked, the shape had vanished. Then the bell rang. A single dull note that rolled through the mist and faded, leaving behind a silence that felt far too deep for such a small place. I decided to head back before the weather closed in completely. The fog had thickened into a pale wall, smudging the line between sea and sky. My shoes left damp prints on the stones, each step sounding too loud, as though the air itself were emptying out. The smell of fish and coal smoke still lingered, but faintly now, as if caught halfway between memory and air. The car waited where I'd left it beside the harbor wall. For a moment I felt relief just seeing it, something solid, modern, unghosted. I climbed in, turned the key. The engine coughed once, then fell silent. Again, nothing but the brittle click of the ignition. I leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the glass, beating into small drops that slid downward in slow motion. I tried the door handle, stepped out, and looked toward the road I'd driven down, but it wasn't there. The lane curved into nothing, a gray that swallowed everything beyond a few meters. I could still hear the ocean, but it sounded wrong, the waves moving too slowly, like a record played at the wrong speed. Then came the bell again, one low metallic note drifting from somewhere inland. It rang twice, unevenly spaced, as though whoever was ringing it had forgotten the rhythm. I followed the sound up a sloping street lined with houses that no longer looked right. Paint colors had changed. A door that had been blue was now green. A window I swore was shattered earlier was perfectly whole. When I reached the post office, the clock above the door caught my eye. Its hand stood at 3:47. I checked my watch. 3:47 exactly. Seconds hand motionless. I tapped the glass, but it refused to move. Inside, faint light flickered, the kind that comes from a single lamp burning oil. I stepped through the door. A man sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper that looked brittle enough to crumble if touched. He looked up, met my eyes with the calm of someone long accustomed to strangers. "You're early," he said. "Early for what?" He folded the paper carefully, almost reverently. "The tide." And I wanted to ask what that meant, but before I could, the lamp guttered and died. The room darkened, and for an instant everything fell silent again. The air, the sea, even my heartbeat. When the sound returned, it wasn't the same. The fog outside had changed color, a faint, unearthly gold, and in that light the harbor looked exactly as it must have 20 years before. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was the light, pale, soft, and entirely wrong. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, but I must have. I was still in the car, window fogged from the inside, my neck stiff from leaning against the seat. The harbor lay before me exactly as I remembered, but the colors were different, cleaner somehow, brighter, as if the air itself had been washed. The fog had lifted overnight, revealing a sky too clear for what I knew should have been late afternoon. The clock on the dashboard read 8:12. My watch agreed, both ticking now, alive again, obedient. For a moment, I thought whatever had happened had passed, that it was just exhaustion and weather and nerves. Then I saw the harbor. The same boats floated where they had yesterday, only now they looked newer. Fresh paint gleamed on their sides. The names stenciled on the hulls weren't the ones I remembered. The lettering old-fashioned, hand-done, neat. Nets hung from posts, but they weren't frayed or stiff. Even the smell was sharper, less stale, like sea air that hadn't aged yet. I stepped out into quiet. The same cobblestones, but they felt cleaner underfoot, as though rain had just passed. Across the square, the post office door stood open, and faint voices drifted from within. Laughter, the scrape of a chair. I hesitated. The last time I'd seen that building, it had been dying. Light flickering, walls gray with age. Now it looked new. Someone had painted the trim a deep green. Flower boxes under the windows overflowed with yellow blooms. A boy, 12, maybe 13, ran past me carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. He didn't slow or look twice. His clothes were old-fashioned, a thick sweater with wooden buttons, boots caked in dry mud. I turned to watch him vanish around the bend, then looked back at the harbor. The water was moving again. The tide had come in. Gulls cried overhead, alive and ordinary. But the air carried a faint distortion, like heat above asphalt, shimmering between me and the world. When I tried to focus, it disappeared. I took a step toward the post office, drawn by the sound of those voices. A woman was laughing, the same voice I'd heard the day before at the fish stall. For the first time, I wondered if it really had been the day before. I crossed the square slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet rhythm of the place. The village was alive now. Children darting between doorways, men unloading baskets from carts, a dog barking somewhere near the cliffs. The same cottages that had felt hollow the day before now breathed with sound and color. I could almost have convinced myself it had all been a mistake, that the fog and exhaustion had twisted my sense of things. Then someone called out, "You're back early." The voice came from the post office doorway. A man in a brown vest leaned against the frame, sleeves rolled to his elbows, cigarette hanging loosely from his mouth. He looked familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. "I'm sorry," I said, stepping closer. "Do I know you?" He grinned, smoke curling from his lips. "Course you do, Mr. Hale. You came through last month, didn't you? Promised to bring those photographs. My pulse skipped. Photographs? He nodded toward my camera, slung over my shoulder. From the fair. You said you'd send them once they were printed. I think you've mistaken me for someone else. His smile faltered just slightly, though his eyes didn't lose that easy familiarity. You always were a joker. He laughed once, softly, and disappeared inside. I stood there, trying to recall if I'd ever given anyone my name. I hadn't. Not to the woman by the stall, not to anyone. And yet he'd said it so casually, as if we were old friends. Further down the lane, the same woman from the day before appeared. She carried a basket again, but her scarf was a brighter red now, her coat dry and neat. When she saw me, she hesitated, only for a second, then smiled faintly. Didn't think I'd see you again so soon, she said. My mouth went dry. Yesterday you told me to leave before the tide came in. Her brow knit together. Yesterday? She looked around, then back at me. You must mean last spring. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. The bell from the church tower rang once. Clear, bright, ordinary. But the faces around me didn't react. The children kept running. The men kept unloading. And the woman kept watching me with polite confusion, as if the sound belonged to a world only I could hear. I took a step back. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as though the stones had shifted slightly underfoot. Somewhere nearby, my own voice called out. Not loudly, just enough to make me turn. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the sea wind, but unmistakably mine. A voice shaped exactly like my own, half a sentence breaking through the hush. Don't stay past dusk. I froze. The square was still alive with movement. Carts creaking, gulls crying, the low chatter of people at the market stalls. But none of them had heard it. Their sounds overlapped in perfect rhythm, every gesture rehearsed, repeating like a melody I was only now realizing had played before. I walked toward the sound, heart pushing against my ribs. The voice came again, closer this time, threading through the mist that had begun to roll in from the edge of the harbor. I followed it down a narrow lane where the cobblestones grew uneven and moss slicked their edges. The air smelled of old wood and salt. At the end of the lane stood a small chapel, half sunk into the hillside. Its roof sagged, but the bell tower was whole, its cross tilted slightly west. I remembered seeing its outline the day before, though I hadn't come this far. The door was open a few inches, enough to let the wind moan through the crack like breathing. I stepped inside. Dust floated through beams of light from the windows. Rows of pews lined the walls, empty except for a scattering of hymnals and the faint smell of wax. The altar at the front bore a brass plaque, polished bright against the decay. The inscription stopped me cold. In memory of Thomas Hale, lost at sea, 1951. My name. The same middle initial. The same date carved below it, June 3rd. My pulse stuttered. I reached out a hand toward the plaque, but before I could touch it, a flicker of movement caught my eye near the back of the room, a figure stepping through the doorway I'd just come from. He moved with my stride. Same jacket, same camera slung across the shoulder. His head turned slightly, and I saw the side of my own face reflected in the dim light. Older somehow, lined by exhaustion I hadn't yet lived. Then the bell above us tolled once, deep enough to shake the air. The sound folded through me, heavy, layered, almost liquid, and the figure was gone. Outside, the village noise had ceased again. The tide was fully in, water licking at the lower steps of the chapel. I stood in the doorway, staring down at the reflection of the church in the water below. There were two of me in it, and one moved slightly later than the other. I left the chapel before the tide reached the steps, though I wasn't sure where to go. The village had gone still again. Whatever noise had filled it earlier had drained away, leaving a hush that clung to the walls. I walked uphill toward the road I'd first come down, certain that if I could just reach the car, the rest would make sense. But the road wasn't where it should have been. It began normally enough, two ruts in the earth bordered by low stone fences. But a few hundred meters on, the hedgerows folded back into fog. I pushed through anyway. The air on the other side was colder, sharper, carrying the faint smell of diesel and something sweet, like burnt sugar. When I emerged, the village lay ahead of me again. Same cottages, same harbor, same crooked sign reading Penhallow Cove. I turned back. The lane behind me had vanished, replaced by a field of wild grass bending under a wind that didn't touch me. For a while I simply walked, tracing the same streets I'd already crossed, hoping for some subtle difference that would prove the world was moving forward. But everything repeated. An old man sweeping his doorstep, the same pair of children chasing a red ball that never lost its shine, a gull circling above that never landed. Even the shadows refused to lengthen. I spoke aloud just to hear a sound that changed. "Hello?" The echo returned immediately, slightly delayed, as though the village needed time to remember how to answer. A shop window caught my reflection as I passed. For a heartbeat it lagged behind, turning its head half a second late. The image was still me, but the camera strap across my shoulder was on the wrong side. Panic crept in only when the familiar clock struck again. One clear chime, then silence. I realized I'd been hearing it every few hours, though the hands on its face had never moved. I tried another route, following the coastline past the pier. The rocks there were slick with mist, and the sea below moved like oil, dense and soundless. Halfway along, I saw tire tracks pressed into the mud, the same tread as my car's. They led forward, then turned back on themselves, a perfect circle. I stood at the edge of the water until my reflection blurred into the gray. Somewhere out on the waves, a foghorn groaned once, long and low, like a voice calling through years instead of distance. I thought of the inscription in the chapel and wondered if the sea was still keeping count of the days I hadn't yet lived. I needed something solid, something that could tell me I wasn't imagining all of it. I tore a page from my notebook and wrote the date in large block letters. April 9th, 1971. Beneath it, I scribbled a single line. I was here. I weighed the paper down with a stone outside the post office door, the same one with the clock that refused to move. Then I walked away without looking back, forcing myself not to glance over my shoulder until I'd counted 100 steps. When I finally turned, the doorway was empty. The stone remained, but the paper was gone. I searched the ground, the street, even the gutters. Nothing. I told myself the wind must have taken it, though the air around me was perfectly still. Farther along, I carved my initials into the wooden railing beside the harbor. The knife dragged easily through the damp grain, leaving clean, wet letters. When I looked up again, the water below reflected the carving perfectly, but backward, as if the image in the tide belonged to another version of the world. I took a photograph to prove it. The shutter clicked, satisfying in its small defiance. I wound the film forward and took another shot of the same spot, then a third from farther back. When I checked through the viewfinder again, the railing was unmarked. No carving, no trace of what I'd done, only smooth wood glistening with mist. I looked at my hands. They trembled. The knife blade was wet but clean. Something inside me shifted then. Not panic exactly, but a recognition that the village wasn't looping around me. It was looping through me. Whatever pattern it followed, I was already part of it. I returned to the square and found the woman again, the one with the red scarf. She stood beside the stall, arranging her fish as if no time had passed at all. I approached slowly, careful with my words. "Do you remember me?" She didn't look up. "Of course. You said you'd bring the photographs." My throat tightened. "What photographs?" "The ones from last time." She lifted her eyes, and there was something tired in them, something rehearsed. "You never brought them." I wanted to tell her that this was the last time, that I hadn't been here before, that this was still happening. But before I could, she smiled faintly, almost with pity. "You'll remember soon enough," she said. Then she turned away, and the fog began to move inland again, folding the village back into itself. The next time the fog thinned, I tried again. I drove until the road ended, turned, and found the same cottages waiting at the next bend. It felt less like traveling in circles and more like being replayed. The world wasn't moving, it was being wound backward around me. I stopped the car outside the chapel. The tide was halfway out, the water dragging in long ribbons that glimmered like film unspooling. I remembered my camera, the one proof I still trusted, and loaded a new roll. Every frame I took was careful, methodical. The harbor, the rooftops, the crooked sign, my own reflection in a shop window. The shutter's click was the only sound left that obeyed me. When the film reached its end, I rewound it and slipped it into my pocket. I told myself I'd keep this one hidden, far from whatever current swallowed the rest. I turned back toward the car and froze. Across the harbor, another figure stood in the same spot I had occupied seconds before, raising a camera to his eye. He moved exactly as I did, a half-beat late, mirroring every motion. For a moment I convinced myself it was the reflection in the tide. Then he lowered the camera and stepped forward onto solid ground. I shouted, but the sound folded in on itself, swallowed before it crossed the water. The second me tilted his head, as if listening, and then began to walk away, toward the chapel. I ran after him, boots slipping on wet stone, but when I reached the door, the interior was dark and empty. Only the brass plaque gleamed in the low light. I lifted my own camera, desperate to catch anything that would stay still long enough to prove itself real. The lens fogged instantly. I wiped it clean, pressed the shutter, and heard 2 clicks. When I looked down, I was holding nothing. My hands were empty, palms damp with salt. The sound had come from somewhere behind me. I turned. My car sat by the wall, engine running, headlights pointed toward the sea. In the driver's seat, someone waited, my outline, my posture, my hands on the wheel. The engine idled once, coughed, and the lights blinked out. By the time I reached the door, the seat was empty, and the key was gone. The tide had returned again, quicker this time. Foam lapped over the footprints I'd left only moments ago, erasing them cleanly, as if the village were taping over the last seconds of a film it never intended to end. By the next morning, if it was morning, the light had flattened into something neither bright nor dim, a pale wash that erased shadows. I couldn't tell if time had passed or folded, only that the air felt thinner, the way it does before a storm. The village no longer surprised me. Its silence had become familiar, almost comforting. I'd stopped expecting the ordinary to behave as it should. The post office still stood at the heart of it all, door half open, clock frozen at 3:47. I watched the second hand tremble once, as if deciding whether to move, and then still itself again. Above the rooftops, gulls wheeled in perfect circles that never widened or shrank. It struck me then that Penhallow Cove wasn't trapped in time. It was time, looping its favorite memory again and again, until the edges wore smooth. I walked the streets with the strange calm that comes when panic has burned itself out. Every corner I turned, I found traces of myself, footprints in mud that hadn't yet dried, cigarette butts of a brand I didn't smoke, a shutter left half open the way I'd left it the day before, or the cycle before that. The village was becoming a map of my mistakes. Near the harbor, the woman in the red scarf stood by the stall again, only now the fish were gone. She smiled when she saw me, not as if greeting someone alive, but the way you smile at a photograph you've seen too many times. "You've been here longer this time," she said softly. I didn't ask how she knew. How many times have I come through? She tilted her head, thinking. As many as the tide allows. Her gaze moved past me toward the sea. But it's wearing thin. What is? The film, she said. It can't keep replaying forever. Her words sank into the quiet like stones into water. I wanted to ask more, but she was already turning away, her scarf catching in the wind before the fog swallowed her completely. I looked down at my hands, fingers stained faintly with salt and rust, and realized I no longer knew whether the sea spray had put it there or time itself. The horizon shimmered. For the briefest second, I thought I saw open water, a way out. Then it rippled, and Penhallow Cove stared back at me again, unchanged. It's strange what memory chooses to hold. Some faces it keeps with cruel precision. Others it softens until they slip away entirely. I began to suspect that Penhallow Cove wasn't keeping me here to punish me, but to remember me, to pin my outline against the fog before the rest of the world let me fade. Down by the docks I found a shed with its door half open. Inside were the faint, orderly ghosts of work, ropes coiled neatly, hooks hung by size, a lantern that still smelled faintly of paraffin. The dust was too even to be real dust. It hadn't gathered so much as stopped. When I ran my hand over a wooden crate, it left no mark. It was as though the air itself refused to acknowledge change. I found a ledger on the table, its pages curled with damp. The handwriting was steady, confident, each entry dated neatly in the same ink. The last one read June 2nd, 1951. The name below it made me sit down. T. Hale. Supplies received. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just my surname. It was mine exactly. For a long time I sat there, listening to the distant hush of waves that never reached the shore. My own handwriting, or someone's memory of it, stared back at me from the page. When I stepped outside again, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The gulls were gone. The air had thickened until every breath carried the taste of salt and metal. Across the harbor, the chapel bell gave a single, exhausted toll. I walked toward it as though pulled. The village seemed to exhale with me. Doors easing open, curtains shifting, faint silhouettes appearing at windows. I had the eerie impression that everything around me was bracing for something it had already endured countless times. At the edge of the water, I saw my own footprints overlapping older ones. The same size, the same pattern, layered so perfectly that they blurred into a single track. That was when it struck me. Penhallow Cove wasn't looping the same day at all. It was stacking them. Every repetition pressed against the next until the difference between past and present collapsed. Somewhere within that collapse, my name had survived. Written in ledgers, spoken by strangers, carved into plaques. The village wasn't keeping me prisoner. It was keeping me intact. And for the first time, the idea terrified me. By the time I reached the chapel again, the tide had drawn back far enough to expose the rocks beneath the stairs. The water retreated reluctantly, as if unwilling to let go. I half expected to see the other me still standing at the doorway with the camera, waiting for the same revelation. But the threshold was empty. Only the brass plaque gleamed faintly in the gray light. In memory of Thomas Hale, Lost at Sea, 1951. I said the words aloud this time, testing how they sounded when they came from my mouth. The echo came back softer, delayed, like the chapel needed a moment to remember how to repeat them. A drawer beneath the altar was open a few inches. Inside, I found a book bound in cracked leather, a parish log. Most of the pages were ordinary enough. Births, baptisms, marriages. Near the end, the handwriting changed, hurried and uneven. The final entry stopped me. The sea took him, but the village will not let him go. There was no date, only a single set of initials beneath it. CM. I stared at the words until they blurred. The thought came quietly, without drama. Maybe I wasn't visiting Penhallow Cove. Maybe it was remembering me the way the sea remembers the shape of a boat long after it's gone. A soft creak made me turn. The door at the back of the chapel had opened slightly. Beyond it, the fog pulsed with faint light, gold bleeding through the gray as if the sun were trying to surface. I stepped outside and found myself at the cliff's edge. The harbor below shimmered with reflections. 2, 3, then dozens of me walking the same paths, turning the same corners, all caught in different layers of light. It wasn't terrifying, exactly. It was familiar, like recognizing your handwriting on a page you don't remember writing. Somewhere among those echoes, one of them looked up at me. I knew instantly that he wasn't from 1971. His clothes were simpler, his hair slicked back, his eyes a little more hopeful. He lifted a hand, not to wave, but to warn. The sea answered him with a low groan, rolling against the rocks below. When I looked again, the reflections were gone. Only the tide remained, climbing quietly back toward the steps. For the first time since arriving, I knew that leaving Penhallow Cove might not mean going home. It might mean disappearing altogether. Leaving Penhallow Cove felt like trying to stand up inside a dream. Every movement possible in theory, but resisted by something soft and invisible. I gathered my things anyway, the camera, the ruined maps, the notebook swollen with damp pages. Each item felt heavier than when I'd arrived, as though they'd absorbed the weight of all the hours that refused to pass. The fog had thinned to ribbons by then, drifting lazily across the harbor. The sea was mirror flat, reflecting a sky that seemed one shade too bright for morning. From where I stood, the village looked almost normal. Quiet, harmless, forgettable. The kind of place you might drive past and never think about again. Yet even from a distance, I could feel it watching me, as if every shutter and doorway were a pupil adjusting to my absence. The car started on the first turn. That small ordinary sound, the engine catching, hit me harder than any revelation. It meant something was still obeying the rules. I took a deep breath, set the gear, and drove uphill toward the road that should have led back to the world. Gravel popped beneath the tires. The steering wheel vibrated faintly in my hands. Halfway up the incline, the air changed. It thickened, not like fog this time, but like resistance itself. The landscape ahead began to shimmer, trees bending in slow motion, the hedgerows bowing and straightening in perfect unison. I pressed harder on the accelerator. The car moved, but the world outside stopped. I looked in the rearview mirror. Penhallow Cove lay behind me exactly as before, the same tide frozen mid-turn, the same gulls suspended in air. My reflection stared back from the mirror, lips parted, eyes wide, and for a heartbeat I thought it wasn't following me anymore. Then I saw movement ahead, a road sign emerging from the pale light. Penhallow Cove, it read. The same chipped paint, the same tilt of the post. I had made a perfect circle. I stopped the car and let the engine idle. The sound felt like defiance in a place that no longer needed sound. When I opened the door, the air outside was colder than it should have been, and I realized I was hearing the tide again. Only it wasn't coming from the sea. It was behind me, inside the village, rising through the streets like a slow heartbeat. The wind carried a single word from somewhere far below: stay. It didn't sound like a command. It sounded like recognition. The sound of the tide followed me back into the village, not waves against rock, but a deep rhythmic pulse moving beneath the ground. Every few seconds it trembled through the cobblestones under my feet. Penhallow Cove no longer looked like a place made of stone and timber. It looked like something being remembered too hard, its edges worn thin by repetition. The air had changed again, faintly metallic, carrying the scent of rain that never arrived. The cottages leaned closer, their lines softened as though drawn in charcoal. Windows flickered with half-light. Somewhere a door swung back and forth, creaking in time with that pulse. I walked toward the harbor, camera hanging useless around my neck. The film inside had rewound itself, the lever refusing to move. Each click of the shutter now made the same dull sound, the sound of nothing being recorded. Down by the pier, the woman in the red scarf stood facing the water. Her reflection swayed in the tide, but the real her was perfectly still. I wanted to ask her what happened to people who stayed, but before I could speak, she turned. Her eyes were calm, distant, almost kind. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. "I never left." She nodded, as if that confirmed something she'd long suspected. "That's what happens," she whispered. "The sea forgets slowly, one name at a time." Behind her, the horizon began to dim. Not darken, dim, as though light itself was growing tired. The air filled with faint whispers, layered voices speaking over one another in slow, blurred tones. I realized they were mine, words I'd spoken on every return, overlapping into a murmur that sounded like the sea breathing. The woman stepped closer, the wind catching her scarf. "You can go," she said, though it didn't sound like permission. "But you'll leave nothing behind to prove you were ever here." I almost laughed. "That's already true." She gave a small, sad smile. "Not yet." I turned toward the road again, but it was gone, replaced by water that gleamed like metal, spreading inward through the streets. My reflection looked up at me from its surface, lips moving a fraction slower than mine. When I blinked, the reflection blinked later. When I breathed, it exhaled after me. And as the first edge of the tide reached my shoes, I finally understood what the bell had always been ringing for. It wasn't a warning. It was a countdown. The tide climbed slowly, deliberate as breath. The first touch of water was shockingly cold, but only for a moment. Then it dulled, numbing my skin until I could no longer tell where it ended, and I began. I stood there, ankle deep, watching the surface ripple outward as if testing the boundaries of its own memory. The houses reflected in the rising water, not clearly, but in fragments. A roof here, a chimney there, the faint shimmer of a curtain moving behind glass. It looked less like flooding and more like a photograph developing in reverse, the image bleeding gently away. Somewhere above me, the bell tolled again. The sound was softer now, drawn thin by distance or exhaustion. I counted 3 rings before it faded. By the 4th, I couldn't be sure whether I was hearing it or remembering it. I took one last photograph, though I knew the film would hold nothing. The click was quiet, almost respectful. When I lowered the camera, the woman in the red scarf was gone. The stalls, the boats, even the smoke that had trailed from the chimneys, all erased, leaving only the impression that they had once existed. The water reached the steps of the chapel, swallowing the plaque where my name had been carved. For an instant I could see it glinting beneath the surface. Thomas Hale, Lost at Sea, 1951, before the silt drifted over it like a curtain closing. The light changed then. It didn't fade so much as settle, like dust after movement. The world took on the hush of something ending quietly, without ceremony. I looked down at my reflection one last time. It stared back with the same tired eyes, the same salt-stung face, but softer somehow, an outline dissolving at the edges. I thought of the woman's words. The sea forgets slowly, one name at a time. When I tried to take a step backward, there was nowhere to go. The horizon had folded inward, a perfect circle of water and mist. I understood then that leaving wasn't about distance, it was about memory, and Penhallow Cove was already forgetting me. My watch ticked once, a single clean sound that startled the silence, then stopped for good. I closed my eyes and listened. The sea breathed in, the bell rang once more, and everything, finally, went still. They never found the village again. Not on any map, not in the archives, not even in the accounts of the fishermen who swore they'd known every inlet along the Cornish coast. Penhallow Cove, it seemed, had slipped quietly from the world the way a name fades from memory. Not all at once, but piece by piece. The photographs developed, but they were blank. Perfect exposures, no scratches, no light leaks, just empty frames of pale gray, as though the camera had tried to capture air that wasn't there. Only one image showed anything at all, the faint outline of a harbor wall blurred by motion, and the suggestion of a figure standing where the tide met the steps. The negatives were labeled in neat handwriting. April 1971, Cornwall. No return address, no further notes. A decade later, the parish records were recatalogued. Among them was an entry misfiled under 1951, Thomas Hale, presumed drowned, body unrecovered. Below it, in smaller script, someone had added a single line, almost like a correction, almost like a prayer, seen again, years later, walking along the water's edge. No one could say who wrote it, and so the story remains as most of them do along the coast, told quietly, late at night, by those who claim to have heard a bell out on the fog, ringing for a village that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, when the sea is still enough, they say you can see the reflection of houses where there are none. And if you wait long enough, you might even see a man standing there holding a camera, looking out toward the tide, as though waiting to be remembered again.